Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us for the first of our Prison Research Meets Practice events that we will be hosting in the Justice Policy Center of the Urban Institute. Today, we have the honor of having a couple of distinguished folks with us to talk about their experiences with restrictive housing reform. And the idea behind this and other sessions in the series is that we'd like to engage a conversation between someone who primarily focuses on the research side of the topic and someone who has worked more in the area of practice. And so today, as I said, we will start with restrictive housing, and future events will focus on other topics in the corrections policy space, including post-secondary education in prison, issues experienced by people with disabilities in prison, the experiences of LGBTQ plus people, and other similar topics. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. The event is being recorded, and the recording will be posted online afterward. We have enabled closed captioning for accessibility, and we also have ASL translation in progress as well. You can adjust your caption settings using the Show Hide Captions button in Zoom. All of the participants are muted, but you can type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time, and we will answer all of those questions at the end of the hour. So we'd also like to remind you to take a couple of minutes at the end to answer any, to complete a survey that we've created for the event. And finally, please engage with us online using the hashtag #live@urban. All right. So I'd like to go ahead and invite the two speakers to come on camera. And we will do some brief introductions before we get started. My name is David Pitts. I'm the Interim Associate Vice President for Justice Policy and a Senior Fellow at the Urban Institute, where I also direct the Prison Research and Innovation Initiative, which is the project that is hosting these events and is sponsored by Arnold Ventures. And I would like to welcome to this session Keramet Reiter, who is a professor and vice dean or vice chair. I promoted you a bit there, Keramet. Vice chair of Criminology Law and Society at the University of California, Irvine. And Sara Sullivan, who is a senior policy advisor in the Bureau of Justice Assistance, Department of Justice. So thank you, Keramet. Thank you, Sara, for joining us today. And I think I'd like to get us started, if it's okay, with Sara, and orient our conversation with a sense of how restrictive housing looks in different types of environments. So can you talk a little bit about how different DOCs, Departments of Corrections, and jail systems use restrictive housing, and maybe talk a little bit about how prevalent its use tends to be?
Sure. Thank you, David. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I'm excited to be able to talk about this topic with you today. So let me start with your second question around the prevalence. So that has changed a lot over the years. The most kind of comprehensive accounting that we have is based on research that has been done by the Lyman Center at Yale University in collaboration with the Correctional Leaders Association. So the most recent figures are from 2021. And it shows about 41,000 to 48,000 people are in restrictive housing on any given day. This is just for prisons, so state prisons and the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So that does not include juvenile facilities. That does not include local jails, solely for state and federal prisons. This also just includes who is there on any given day. So as I said, 41 to 48,000 on any given day. If you look at how many people serve time in a year or throughout their period of incarceration, that number is much higher. But that is an improvement on where we started, or at least since Lyman started conducting this research. So to give an example, the first report they put out back in 2015 had between 80 and 100,000 people. So we're a little more than half from that point. Now, I will say there are differences in the way the data has been collected over the years, so it's not a perfect apples to apples comparison, but it's the best comparison we have. So we have made a lot of progress, but there's obviously still a long way to go. And where you get those numbers, I'm going to oversimplify it just for the purpose of generalizing, because it looks different in every jurisdiction. But typically, restrictive housing is made up of 3 different types. There's disciplinary segregation. That's when people break the rules or violate a rule of a facility. They go and are sentenced, or they go to a hearing officer and they're sanctioned for a period of time in segregation. They serve that sentence, and then ideally they come back to general population. Next one is administrative segregation. This is more what I would call preventative segregation, when it's not a direct response to a violation, but because of a variety of factors, the facility has determined that that person is at risk to the safety and security of the institution. And so they put someone in segregation administratively in order to limit their availability or access to commit a violation. And then the third one is protective custody. Most systems have protective custody. Not all put protective custody people in restrictive housing. Many do. Protective custody is where you are in a separate environment because you yourself are at risk of being harmed if you were out in general population. And as I said, most people or most systems have protective custody separate. Some are in environments similar to general population, but some of them are in environments very similar to restrictive housing, and some are actually housed in restrictive housing itself. So there's other reasons, but those are kind of the bulk of the reasons why people are in restrictive housing and how systems use it. The last one I will add is around COVID medical isolation. So there are systems throughout the COVID pandemic, especially during heightened times, in order to adhere to medical isolation or quarantine needs. There are some facilities, some systems that house people that needed to be isolated in restrictive housing during that isolation time.
Thanks, Sarah. That's very helpful, and it's great to get a sense of what the landscape looks like going into the conversation. And I think if I can move to Keramet now, obviously what we've just discussed is a large number of people who are impacted by this. It's maybe less than it used to be, but it's still a large number of folks that experience restrictive housing. And we know that there's a pretty strong body of research that discusses the negative impacts of restrictive housing on those that experience it. So I'm wondering if you might be able to walk us through some of the main findings of that work and your own work is relevant.
Absolutely. Thanks, David. And thanks, Sarah, for the overview. One thing I think it's helpful to start with when we think about the effects is how widespread they are. So we hear the numbers from Sarah, but there's a growing body of work that suggests that as many as 1 in 4 people in a given system experience solitary confinement over the course of their incarceration, right? So I've done a lot of work in Washington State. We found 1 in 4. There's some national data suggesting that people are increasingly starting to look at this idea of cycling. So when we hear 10 or 20,000, that sounds like a relatively small number, even relative to the number in prison. But as I start to talk about the harms of these conditions, when we think about how many people are in prison and how many people are coming out every year, I think it's important to contextualize it that way. So, I often say we've been running a mass experiment with solitary confinement, using it on the scale and durations we have for the last 20 or 30 years. And we're just starting to really understand the long-term impacts of that. And they are both psychological and physical. So a more robust body of work helps us to understand that when you put people in a cell without human contact for 23 or more hours a day for days or months at a time, there are severe psychological consequences. This is often described as security housing unit or SHU syndrome. So this idea that there's a constellation of symptoms you experience like depression, anxiety, insomnia, problems managing your anger, problems with nightmares. And together, this constellation of symptoms has been called SHU syndrome. It's like akin to post-traumatic stress disorder. And as people have started to look at solitary confinement use, they find incredibly high rates of these kinds of psychological symptoms in solitary. So in work I did with a random sample of just over 100 people in solitary confinement in Washington State, we found that as many as half experienced significant psychological symptoms like anxiety and depression. So on a psychiatric scale, they were rating really high as experiencing these things frequently and persistently. Similarly, in a really striking study looking at solitary confinement on Rikers Island, the jail in New York City, they found that half of all suicides and self-harm incidents were happening in solitary confinement, even though only 5 to 10% of the population was in solitary at any given time. So that's to say that there's often just a massively disproportionate indication of mental health symptoms in solitary, higher rates of serious mental illness, higher rates of self-harm and suicide. And these effects often persist over the long term. So that's the psychological growing body of disturbing evidence. And it makes sense, right? I mean, we know from basic psychology studies that if you impose sensory deprivation or you deprive them of human contact, there are all kinds of psychological symptoms. This has been documented in experiments in military studies around prisoner of war experiences. And now we're seeing it in the body of literature around solitary confinement. There's a smaller but growing body of literature about the physical harms of solitary confinement, which is interesting because I often say legally it can be hard to see visibly, literally, what happens to someone when they're deteriorating psychologically, but the physical harms are often easier for the courts to recognize, easier for us to kind of see and make sense of. So there's a little bit of work suggesting that your brain can shrink in solitary confinement. Most of this work has been done with animals and labs, but there are some case studies about people in really remote areas like scientists in Antarctica showing that there's changes to the shape of the brain. There's some studies showing that the cardiovascular burdens of being in solitary might be significant. So people have a higher risk of heart failure after having spent time in solitary. In my own work in Washington State, we found a lot of physical symptoms people describe persistently in solitary, musculoskeletal problems as a result of the really limited physical mobility in those places. Sometimes they would over-exercise, like doing thousands of push-ups a day and injure themselves. Sometimes they wouldn't be able to move at all and they would have atrophy. And also problems associated with chronic illness and getting care. We know that healthcare in prisons can be pretty limited in the best case scenario, and in solitary confinement, often people just literally have trouble getting in touch with anyone who can help them if they're in crisis or if they have a chronic health condition. And sleep problems are really common. Also skin problems, because there's really usually limited natural light. So those are just a range of, maybe more than you wanted, David, but a range of the kinds of symptoms that people experience in these conditions that, again, over time, we're getting more and more robust understanding about.
No, that's not more than I wanted. That's really helpful. Thank you. A lot of research there that I had not known about myself, so I appreciate the overview. But I think thinking about this, going back to Sara for a moment, so we have this body of research, and at the same time, we know that a lot of folks in the corrections field working on the ground are pretty strong proponents of keeping restricted housing as a tool in their toolkit. And so in your work with departments of corrections and jail systems, what seems to be, in your experience, the basis for that resistance?
Yeah, I will say, especially over the past, 5 to 10 years, there has been a growing number of prison officials, administrators who are really open to change, and some have become really huge advocates of it. It's the whole reason why, when I worked at the Vera Institute, we worked with 16 different jurisdictions, both state, prison, and local jail systems. They invited us in because they wanted to reform their use of restrictive housing and invited us in to figure out how to do it. But of course, not all officials in every system is for it. And not all times will that change desire at the administrative level translate down to kind of the line staff, supervisors, middle management level. And there's a few reasons, I say, why this is, or that we hear from staff about why they're resistant. One major one is just it's a tool that they've used for so long, and it had become in a lot of systems the go-to response for any type of violation, right? Instead of this being, if this is the most severe response, the idea of saving it for the most severe behavior, that's not really what was happening. And there's an argument, we could talk about that a little later on, for why nobody should be in restrictive housing. But if you go by that mindset, but that's not what was happening in a lot of places. So for example, when we worked in North Carolina a few years ago, that's actually several years ago now, when we worked in North Carolina, 99% of people who were found guilty of any infraction winded up getting a sanction in restrictive housing. So this is, become the go-to response. Another main reason is just lack of training about how to appropriately respond to behavior, right? The folks who are working in these units are dealing with people with mental health issues, or dealing with people with substance abuse issues, or dealing with people with anger management issues, a whole set of challenges. And a lot of them do not have the appropriate training for how to manage that in a way that's not just sending them to restrictive housing, which sometimes is the easiest and sometimes most efficient way, even if it's not the most effective and a very damaging way to respond to it. Another main reason is lack of alternatives, right? Lack of options of what else you can do. There's one thing for training, but you actually have to have options. And that doesn't happen in a lot of places. So like when I worked with New York City, at the time that we did our analysis in New York City, their responses to violations were verbal reprimand, a fine, or restrictive housing. That was it. Those were their three options. So they really, other than the verbal reprimand and fine, their main option was restrictive housing. And so, needing to add alternatives, because in a system like that, if you stop using restrictive housing, what we would hear from folks in New York City is people aren't having being held accountable for their behavior. And part of the way they were right, because if they weren't getting restrictive housing, the other option was just a verbal reprimand and nothing else. And then there are two other ones that one is just a fear that it'll make the facilities less safe. And so in those systems, we work with them a lot on tracking the data as they're implementing reforms to show that in many instances, it actually makes facilities more safe, not less safe. And then the last one, which I think is the harder nut to crack, is some staff just really buy into the idea of the retribution mindset. You committed a violation, you need to be punished for it. And so, that one is working to, again, ensure that it's not that we're not holding people accountable for their behavior, it's that restrictive housing is not the appropriate way to hold them accountable. And that's all just what I talked about, mostly focused on disciplinary segregation. With the administrative segregation, that, is a little bit harder in figuring out, people are in administrative segregation because the facility has determined, right, there are risks to the safety and security of the institution. And so staff need to see that there's an alternative way to house that population and respond to that population in a way that will make them effective when they are not in restrictive housing. So they feel comfortable saying, okay, like I'm on board with this. And, a lot of times once people start seeing the results, they're on board. And sometimes the biggest resistors can be the biggest advocates. But it takes time, and we'll get to this in a future question, but this really shows the importance of getting staff buy-in when you're reforming a system.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And actually, I want to stick with you for a minute, Sarah, and touch on something that you talked about just a brief bit. And that's that if we think about these systems from a lens, I guess, of an organization, DOCs are pretty unique. They're very hierarchical, right? So they have a lot of top-down decision-making, but they also simultaneously give line staff a lot of discretion to act in their day-to-day work. And so when you're working with organizations, whether it's a DOC or a jail or a system, how do you approach reform when you have both of those top-down and bottom-up dynamics working at the same time?
Well, because as you call it, top down or bottom up, that's also how you have to look at reform, and also from the middle out. So when you're looking at how to reform a system, you can't just talk with the, administrators about the best way to reform the system. You have to engage staff at all levels in that process from the beginning. One, because engaging them will ensure that the reforms are actually more successful, because they're the ones working with the population day in and day out, right? They're the ones dealing with whatever challenges it is that they're faced with. And so the more they are included in the reforms will be better for it, but also the more bought in they will be, right? I mean, if staff is a part of coming up with the solutions and they're more bought into the solutions being effective, as opposed to if they're just being told by administration, this is the reforms that we're implementing, then they're almost bought in for them not to work because they weren't kind of consulted and engaged in the process. And I would say the same thing applies for the incarcerated population. We've engaged with incarcerated folks, both in restrictive housing and out of restrictive housing, about what these reforms could look like. And that has, been very helpful in, again, getting buy-in and also coming up with what the solutions would be. It's interesting, as you say, David, like these systems are very hierarchical, they're paramilitary, but even in environments like that, you have to get buy-in, or it's just not, one, it's not going to work, and it's not going to be sustained, right? I mean, we know, when I worked for the Department of Corrections in Illinois, a new administrator would come in, a new director, and, the view was, any changes that they wanted to make, we were here long before you came, we're going to be here long after you leave, we're just going to ride out this wave of this administration until the next one comes in, right? And so if you want change to be sustained through different administrations, that's going to take buy-in from all levels of staff to see that these changes are really beneficial for everyone, including them.
So Keramet, despite being, I guess, a researcher and faculty member, you've worked with DOCs and you've done some work on the ground with them. So I'm curious to get your insights on the same general question, which is how you can get DOCs and systems to pursue change in spite of these organizational dynamics that, as Sara just discussed, can be pretty complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sara raised so many good points that are worth highlighting. A key one to me is just staff buy-in, right? And I think there are so many interesting ways to do that. And I think one is to help them to understand and see how harmful these conditions are for them, right? I mean, I think I didn't really understand until I started spending hundreds of hours in solitary confinement units that the staff working in those units are also in solitary confinement, right? And it's a horrible place often to be working. They're suffering similar health consequences to what people incarcerated there are suffering. And as Sara pointed out, they often really lack the tools, right? I mean, often they're dealing with people who psychiatric hospitals have said are too difficult for us to manage. So we're going to send them from someone with an MD who's trained to do this into a solitary confinement unit with someone who may not even have a bachelor's degree and probably has no training in dealing with this population, and say, you handle it, right? And I think that creates an immense amount of stress, and acknowledging that and working with people to think about how that stress could be mitigated is really key, right? So I think there is, like, the kind of work Vera has done, in my experience, even in research, sitting down and saying to people, tell me about your job and how it's hard, becomes a really important moment for reflection and a spot where you can start to have conversations. And I think, one of the more exciting things happening in states like Washington is bringing correctional officers to see other systems and imagine other ways. So there's an organization called Amend that Washington State has partnered with that takes people to Scandinavia, especially Norway, to see an alternative model, right? Not to say we could replicate it, but to say, here's what it looks like in a different system with a different way of approaching this, where staff are healthier day to day, where they have higher life expectancies and lower chronic health problems. and can you think about what you might take there back to your institution to have this kind of health for everyone in the institution, for prisoners, for incarcerated people and staff? So I think that's one exciting model. I think just to step back from big picture, some of the things Sara was talking about, when we think about like all the different kinds of people who end up in solitary confinement and places like New York State where there just aren't good options for what to do with them, right? Like you have a violation and everybody goes to solitary. I think there's been a lot of great reform with the low-hanging fruit around how we overuse solitary confinement across the United States. And if we can think about, are there people there who really don't need to be there? Are there people there for much longer than they need to be there, and reduce both the use and the lengths of time? So that's another place where Washington State, I think, has been a real leader in saying, let's make sure we don't have people in solitary who have mental health issues, right? Who are committing self-harm. Let's figure out how to get those people out of solitary and into more care-oriented environments. Similarly in California, right, around more in response to organizing by people in prison, but there's been a sense of, oh, we just put people in solitary because they have a gang label and we can't do that anymore. And that has been successful in terms of just reducing the raw number of people, looking at the lengths of stay and trying to reduce those. I think then we're left with a really tough population that a lot of states that have been at the forefront of reform are now grappling with, right? What do you do with the people who have serious mental illnesses that have not been well managed, are young and have life sentences and engage in fights every time they get out of their cell and they have nothing to lose, right? They've got the longest sentence they can have. So I think there are really challenging populations in solitary, and that's where some of the most interesting and the hardest work is happening. And again, it's where the staff buy-in is so important to say, okay, like, you spend day in and day out with this person who you're afraid to let out of their cell. Let's really think about what are some interventions, what are some behavioral modifications, what are some tools that could help us think about alternatives, and then can we use those, once we develop good tools in one tough situation, can we use them in other situations? But I often think of solitary as having these kind of two components of overuse that's just massively out of control. And I think a lot of places like Vera and Washington State have done good work around it. And then these tougher cases that we're all still kind of thinking about, how do we reduce even further?
No, that's a great point. And I think, as we think through all of these efforts to work with the organization to pursue change and to work with and partner with DOCs and systems, we're always partnering with a leader at the time, a commissioner, an executive director, a warden who is in a position and willing to work with us, but that person's not always there. And so I want to ask Sara a little bit about this question of sustainability, because we see a lot of movement within systems in terms of leadership particularly. And I'm curious if you've seen ways that promote sustainability of change in this space and that make the work that you do successful in the long haul, not just in the short term.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few ways to sustain the reforms. And one big one that we've already talked about is the buy-in of staff, right? Colorado is one of the systems that is highlighted, that has done some of the, most comprehensive work in reforming their use of restrictive housing. And they did so much work getting staff buy-in, and staff saw the results that now if you go and talk to some staff, they don't want to go back to the way it was before. So that, is a big way to make those changes, because then you have a whole variety of staff who are going to fight against the opposite direction, right? Are going to fight against the increased use of it if another administration comes in. The other ways are to codify in legislation the changes that were made. That's something that the new director of the Department of Corrections in Nevada, Jim DeZarenda, is a big proponent of, is once you make those changes within a system and see what works and then codifying those in legislation, or the other way around, having the legislation pass and then the reforms being implemented. I would say you need both, right? Because there's so many ways around guidelines on restrictive housing, right? And Keramet and I have talked about this a lot beforehand. How do you define restrictive housing, right? So if you say people can't be in restrictive housing for more than 15 hours a day, and then you define restrictive housing as people who are in their cells for more than in their cells for 22 or more hours a day. Well, a system that really isn't bought into reform can just say, okay, we'll just make restrictive housing. People are in their cells for 21 hours a day, and then it doesn't count, and we can keep them in there for as long as we want. And so you need both that internal buy-in and the staff buy-in, as well as the, codifying in legislation. So you have both components going forward in order to ensure that it's successful. And then one other way is also repurposing restrictive housing units. So as a system reduces the restrictive housing population, starting to empty some of those restrictive housing units and completely changing it and repurposing it for something else, right? There's that whole view that if you build it, they will come. If you have empty restrictive housing cells, if you have empty restrictive housing units, eventually they will be used up. And the question is, what do you want to use them for? And if you completely change the layout and the structure of those units and use it for a completely different purpose, that makes it a lot harder to then start filling it up with restrictive housing beds again than if it's an empty unit that, the way a lot of systems have overcrowding issues still, even though we've reduced the population of people that are incarcerated, there's still a lot of systems that are dealing with overcrowding issues or staffing issues. It's just so much easier to fill that back up if it's sitting empty and you haven't repurposed it for something else.
Thanks. Yeah, and I want to move to Keramet and stick with something though that Sara mentioned, which is that, of course, partnering with DOCs is one lever, but legislation is another. So if we think about, state legislatures, for example, have you seen that to be a tool that's useful in reducing or eliminating restrictive housing within the state DOCs that they, in theory, govern?
Yeah, this is complicated, right? I mean, we started with do we even know how to count how many people are in solitary, and do we even have good evidence about? And so really tracking these reforms over time is complicated. But having been in this space for a few decades now, like Sara, I think one thing I've seen is that all these levers matter, right? That it actually what seems to work best is when you have litigation and legislation and collaboration with institutes like Vera or Amend that are trying to give people tools. And those things also work within states and between states, right? So one thing I've seen is that Washington State looks to California and says, oh, they're being sued. Can we get ahead of that, right? And states look to other states and say, oh, they have legislation pending. Can we do something that puts us in front of that kind of legislative oversight, right? That shows that we're taking steps independently as a correctional entity. So I think that, thinking of all of these pieces as really important and part of both state level and national conversations that help move the dialogue forward is important. In California, we saw people in prison organizing around hunger strikes in the early 2000s, and we're seeing it right now in Texas, right? And those hunger strikes are bringing massive media attention. And in California, that attention led to information about how many people were in solitary for the first time, that there were more than 500 people who'd been in solitary for more than 10 years in California. And that then became evidence to certify a class of prisoners and to bring litigation about those really long terms of confinement, indefinite confinement for those people that led to real reforms in those policies. And now there's legislation pending in California. And I think we've seen those kinds of iterative models in many states and people looking to each other and seeing what's working and what's not. But in terms of moving forward, I do think, both we've been talking about staff buy-in and working with them for sustainability. I also think transparency is really important, right? It's one of the things I often harp on in litigation and legislation is we need to know, right? We need basic data about who's in solitary so that we can see whether it's going up or down over time, and we can look at where the pressure points are, right? Are you doing a good job of getting gang members out of solitary, but you still have a lot of seriously mentally ill people there? So really basic descriptive information that we often don't have can really help us all think together about alternatives. So I often say in litigation and legislation and policy, right? I mean, I think part of why Washington State has been so successful is that they collect the data to see what they're doing, and then to think about whether it's working or not. And it's not true of many other states. So a few points, many ways to think about this, but.
I want to stick with you for a second, Keramet, though, and ask a little bit more about the litigation piece, because I'm curious what your thoughts are on the legal frameworks that are available to people who would like to bring litigation for this, and how successful you've seen that in state courts.
Yeah, it's mixed. I mean, maybe because I have a law degree, I'm particularly cynical about the litigation. But there has been progress, right? I mean, some of the first things we learned about solitary confinement in its modern iterations, when we started building big supermax facilities in the 1980s across the US, some of the first things we learned about those facilities were from litigation in California about the conditions there. And ultimately, in a case in the mid-90s, California held that people could be left in solitary confinement indefinitely, but that case, Madrid, found that seriously mentally ill people needed to be excluded and put in other places with more access to mental health care. And that case, although it was a federal case, but it was just in California, right? It was a district court decision, so it wasn't appealed to the Supreme Court or anything. But that case is a case many people have pointed to for both the principle that seriously mentally ill people should not be placed in solitary. And that's a place where there's been an immense amount of success in litigation around the country to try to protect the most vulnerable from placement in solitary, movements around juveniles and pregnant women also. On the other hand, the case held that solitary confinement was okay, right? There was no ultimate finding that the conditions were unacceptable or that there were caps on the time people could spend in those conditions. And that too has been a principle that was prescient in terms of how litigation has gone across the United States, that it is very rare for a court to find that any period of time in solitary confinement is unconstitutional or in violation of the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Once in a while, there's a case, an egregious case of like one individual, right, who spent 30 or 40 years in solitary confinement, often with no disciplinary violation whatsoever and a questionable reason for placement in the first place. And courts have said, this is unconstitutional for this individual, but never in a kind of sweeping way that gives hope that the federal courts or the Eighth Amendment are going to be, the way to end this practice. But I think it has made really important inroads, both in shedding light on the practice, in reforming, in protecting some vulnerable people, and also in reforming the policies about how and why people are placed there. So I mentioned the hunger strikes in California and the litigation there. That case was ultimately settled, but with a promise about people needing to understand, have a specific reason why they were placed in solitary confinement, like breaking a specific serious prison rule and a fixed period of time. So again, it is one piece of a broader conversation that I think is really important, but it's not going to be the only piece or the silver bullet that fixes solitary confinement.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. And I think, that's one piece of the solitary confinement restrictive housing puzzle. And then restrictive housing is one piece of a broader set of issues, I think, that I would call conditions of confinement. And Sara, I think I actually would like to hear both of you respond to this, but Sara, I'll kick it to you first, which is to ask, how does this fit into a larger set of reforms that need to take place within prison conditions more broadly? Should this be a priority? Should it be the priority? How should this fall into the other work that many reformers are doing?
I mean, the way I think about restrictive housing is it is a symptom of massive problems within a prison environment and a prison culture and a general population to begin with, right? So when you're looking at reforming restrictive housing, you really don't need to look at restrictive housing. What you need to look at is what's happening in general population that lands people there to begin with. So I would say that while it is important to have these restrictions on restrictive housing, if you have appropriate treatment of people with mental health issues, if you have sufficient training of staff, if you have ways to keep people safe in the general population where they actually are safe and they feel safe, when you have all of these changes that happen in the general population setting, then your use of restrictive housing just as a result of that will really be dramatically reduced. You still need to have those reforms for restrictive housing for those, handful of cases that all these other changes won't address. But, these are all intertwined, right? There's not like one or the other, right? Looking at making changes to restrictive housing means you have to make changes in general population, and looking at making changes in general population will result in a lower reduction or a reduction in the use of restrictive housing. So these things are kind of intertwined. It's not one or the other. And I would say some of the best reforms that I've seen in systems to eliminate the use of restrictive housing is when they looked at a complete change and overhaul in the way the general population is managed, in a way that is not a punitive environment, that is an environment that helps people excel. And I'll, highlight one of those, which is some of the work that happened in Connecticut and now in North Dakota and some other places with the young adult units, these kind of new young adult units that are taking a model from some of the European countries, from Germany and from the Netherlands. It's also a project former colleagues of mine from the Vera Institute have been working with systems to implement, but their main focus is on completely revamping the way their general population units are run and the way young people are housed and the way young people are managed. And one of the results of that is they're not allowed to use restrictive housing, but that's just one piece of a whole host of general population reforms.
Keramet?
Yeah, I agree that these things are all integrated, right? And I would go maybe even one step further in terms of the degree of integration and say that I think our entire prison system is based on a model of deprivation, right? Like we deprive you of things that you would have in basic society. And as you go up every security level, you get more secure, we deprive you of more and more and more. And solitary confinement is the ultimate deprivation. And I think that when we see the system that way, it becomes clearer that it's really hard to imagine getting rid of solitary confinement, right? And we've seen this with reforms, because whatever the deprivation is, like we're still going to have a facility where you have maximum deprivation. Maybe maximum deprivation is 21 hours out of your cell for 15 days 21 hours in your cell for 15 days rather than 23 hours in your cell for 30 days. But it's still a place where we have extreme deprivation in the context of a system of deprivation. And so I think when we see it that way, it becomes all the more important to think about how we talk about reforms, right? And that if we talk about getting rid of solitary, it's almost an illogical thing to make in illogical claim or attempt to make in a system of deprivation, because the whole system kind of depends on that deepest end. And so I worry sometimes with solitary confinement reform, right? That we have this idea that it's this like tumor we can cut out of the system and then everything will be better. And as Sara suggested, right, it's an integral part of the fabric of the system. And so we have to think about reweaving the entire fabric in new ways. So yeah, I feel like Sara gave all the really good concrete examples, and I would just abstract out to say, sometimes I worry about this idea that there's a magic bullet that just gets rid of solitary, and that doesn't acknowledge, the structure of a system that needs more resources and needs to think more about how we can get people what they need when 95% of them are coming home, instead of what's the maximum we can take away from them and how we can meet their minimum needs. Yeah.
Thank you. That's great. And I notice we have gotten tons and tons and tons of really great questions as we've been going along. So I think we'll go ahead and shift to some audience questions, if that's okay with the two of you. And
Sure.
Keramet, I think if it's okay, I'd like to start with a question specifically for you, which is, you had mentioned earlier in the session about how, for example, I think it was Washington DOC employees had gone to some Scandinavian countries to see how prison conditions operated there. And so I'm curious, or the audience member is curious to know about whether restrictive housing is used in European prisons, how it's used in European prisons, maybe how our folks from the US reacted to those policies and generally what they look like.
Yeah, I saw and appreciated that question. Well, I will start with Scandinavian prisons like Norway and Denmark. I've spent more time studying prisons in Denmark, use solitary confinement, and they long have, right? So again, to my point that solitary confinement is integral to prisons, it is a thing that is used around the world. So it's not that there is no solitary in Scandinavia, but I think that it looks different. And that is one of the really interesting places where organizations like Amend and correctional officers from the US who go visit Scandinavian prisons kind of look at just the aesthetic differences, right? People often, when they see prisons, if anyone's seen the Michael Moore video where he goes to a prison in Norway, they look more like IKEA showrooms. So even in solitary confinement, you might have a comfortable bed, some pictures, a window, maybe even a phone. I often tell a story about interviewing someone in solitary confinement in Denmark who had access to a kitchen. So he made me crepes before our interview. Which I thought they were teasing me when the correctional officer told me, right? So it is day to day, it is much less deprived than a physically, aesthetically, than a solitary confinement unit in the United States. And of course, it's used much less, right? Even though they use it, it's a smaller portion of an already much smaller system. But I think the thing that is most interesting that I've seen in trainings, right, like in thinking about what principles can we use from Scandinavia, is the person-to-person contact that happens in Scandinavian prisons. So the idea that someone was in their cell and never had a face-to-face conversation without handcuffs is more foreign to Scandinavian prison, even if they're spending 23 hours a day alone in a cell. So even Anders Breivik in Norway, kind of the worst criminal they'd ever had, who set off a bomb in front of parliament and killed a bunch of kids at a political summer camp. There are correctional officers who sit and play cards with him every day because in part, I think, not because they think that's what that one individual deserves, but because they see that as the way he's treated is the worst way anyone is going to be treated in the system. And they want a higher bar for that than we have in the United States. And I think that's where people who go to Scandinavia, correctional officers say, my God, like you're letting that guy out, you're talking to him like he doesn't have handcuffs on, he's using a knife to make a meal in the kitchen. And I think that's where a lot of the work around culture reform is, how can we make it so these two people feel like they can be in the same space and feel safe together without handcuffs and weapons? And if we can do that, everybo's more comfortable, right? If you're not afraid walking into a room every day at work, you will have better health outcomes. And if you can get people to be comfortable having human interactions, you can get them back into the general prison population and maybe even back out into society. So I think that's a place where a lot of the really interesting work is happening, is like literally talking to correctional officers about what do you do? How do you talk to people so that you have less aggressive interactions? And, it's both about being trained to feel like you're physically in control of the situation and also being emotionally sensitive in the way you're talking to people. And it turns out, it seems like that's possible. People are just beginning to study some of this work in US correction systems, but I'm very hopeful about it.
Great, thank you. Thank you. And the next question that I'd like to ask is for Sara. And if we start from a place where we assume that people who are incarcerated are occasionally going to need to be sanctioned for things, what are the alternatives that we might propose to solitary confinement restrictive housing? Are there examples of things that correctional officers have implemented in your experience that are successful with people who are in crisis, behavior modification, those sorts of things?
Yeah, so this is gonna differ depending on the population, right? That's why, when we would go in and do an evaluation, we wanted to determine not only why people were going into restrictive housing, but who was going into restrictive housing. Because if you have someone with a serious mental illness and you have somebody else that is because of the nature of their crime, at risk of being harmed if they are in the general population, and you have someone who is committing a lot of violence in a facility, right? it's going to look very different for those three people, right? So you have to, one thing is you have to have targeted approaches and individualized approaches depending on the needs of the individual that you're working with. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is it can't be just a punishment approach. And as Keramet was saying, a lot of what we focus on in our criminal justice system, and then that translates into our correction system, is the punishment mentality. But you really need to have both an incentive and punishment approach, right? So you need to incentivize the behavior that you want, not just punish the behavior that you don't want. And guess what happens when you're incentivizing the behavior that you want? If you don't get that behavior, then they just don't get that incentive. And that in itself is the punishment, right? So when this, again, going back to taking a whole revamp of a population, there's a lot of systems where people just get kind of the baseline of what they're required to get. So when you just get the baseline of what you're required to get, you're not allowed to have that taken away. And so then you're limiting your options for quote unquote punishment. Where if, people were able to, I don't know, there's places where they hand out tablets, right? And maybe you don't get access to your tablet, right? Or if you vandalize some of the property, right, you have to clean up the area for, the next week. I mean, there's like small things like that, but then there's bigger and more complex, right? When you're dealing with or talking about people with mental illness, there are systems that have set up, alternative units that are treatment focused, right? They're treatment oriented. One of the things I think we've done a better job at than others is ending the use of solitary for people with serious mental illness. And the alternatives to that are when somebody is having a mental health episode, when somebody is deteriorating, that there is a treatment approach to how to respond to that, not a punishment approach, because punishment is not going to work for that individual. Punishment doesn't work for most of us, but punishment is not going to work for that individual. And so what you really need to do is treat the underlying behavior. And I would say the underlying behavior issue is a lot of what the alternatives are, right? If you have someone, another big reason why people are sent into restrictive housing is because of they're caught with drug paraphernalia or they're positive on a drug test. Well, there are systems like Ohio who says, we're going to give you an option to go into drug treatment. And if you pick that option, that is the response, right? It's thinking more of what the response should be to the behavior than actually what the punishment should be to the behavior. Is what the response is. Is our goal to punish this person, or is our goal to ensure this person doesn't commit that violation again that makes us all more safe? And if the goal is to really stop that behavior from happening, then you have to look at how to treat that underlying behavior, whether it's with treatment or whether it's with counseling or whether it's with programming, whatever that is going to be much more effective than any punishment you're going to give somebody.
Thank you. That's great. And I'm going to totally switch gears now and ask Keramet a question that I actually wonder about myself, which is about the research base on the impact of solitary confinement restrictive housing. And so that's teasing out some of the things that happen after you were in restrictive housing from the things that maybe you were predisposed to before you were sent there. So if we think about this idea of mental illness and issues that happen to you emotionally, mentally, how do we know what was first? How do we know what came second? And how do we sort of sort out how that operates?
Yeah, this is really tough, right? Because we know, as Sara was just saying, people with serious mental illnesses are overrepresented in solitary confinement. So we know that people who have serious mental illnesses end up there because they have trouble following rules. And then we know that once people are there, sometimes they develop symptoms. And figuring out that trajectory, especially in a system that doesn't provide good care, which is true of many of our systems, is just really, really hard, if not impossible. So I think we're stuck often knowing that there's an overwhelming amount of evidence that that these conditions are exacerbating, right? And we see that just because of the high rates of illness in solitary confinement as opposed to in the general population, right? All of these different studies about rates of self-harm, rates of representation of mental illness. So I often find the most helpful way to think about it as a magnifying lens, right? I think our prison system is a magnifying lens for a lot of social problems like failures of healthcare or failures of education. And often what you see in solitary confinement is a magnification again of those kinds of problems. I don't know if we'll ever know exactly where the chicken and egg is, particularly once we start to understand how frequent cycling through solitary confinement is, right? So this is another thing that as we've started to study this practice a bit more, we understand that it's not that we have people who've been in solitary and people who haven't, right? When I give you that statistic about 1 in 4 people in Washington state who've been in solitary over the course of their incarceration, or 1 in 10 in the United States, that means it's really hard to isolate who's had this quote treatment, that's an offensive way to think about it, but who's had this experience and who hasn't. We're never going to be able to run any kind of true experiment. We just have to look at the experiences of the tens of thousands of people who've now been in these conditions, and what we see is an exacerbation. And I once was testifying about this, and an advocate said, we don't need any more research, we know enough. And in some ways, I think that's true, right? I think there's huge value to transparency and research. And in some ways, it doesn't really matter about the details of exactly what caused what. We know that these conditions are harmful, extremely harmful. And they exacerbate however people landed there in the first place.
Thank you. No, that's very helpful. I appreciate it. And unfortunately, we're getting toward the end of the hour. We have tons and tons of questions that we're not going to be able to get to. So I apologize to the folks submitting those for that. But I want to ask Sara one last question briefly, and that is that we all are in an environment when we're working with DOCs these days of workforce scarcity. The prisons that they operate are severely understaffed. How can we expect DOCs that do not have enough staff to operate a facility to implement changes like those that folks in this area often suggest when it comes to restrictive housing? Is it reasonable to assume we can get that done at this moment in time?
My question back will be, how can we assume that they can't? I mean, running restrictive housing units is the most staff intensive units to run. You're bringing everything to them. If you are a system that really believes in providing the appropriate, let's say, mental health treatment to folks, you're now putting people in environments where you're increasing their need for mental health treatment. So, right, medical staff and mental health staff are some of the biggest areas where people are really struggling with recruitment and retention. And so the more people you put in restrictive housing, you're actually increasing your need for more mental health treatment, more mental health staff, more medical staff. And you're just exacerbating that staffing problem. Now, I will kind of give a caveat to that, or not a caveat, but, to be my own devil's advocate, which is, this isn't simple, and this doesn't take no staff time, right? I mean, this is a huge undertaking that systems will be taking on. And so there's ways to pilot things first to make sure they're successful before you do it across an entire, do it across the board. It does take more time to train staff. But there are some low-hanging fruit that take no additional staff time. That would be a big focus, right? Like some examples that don't take any staff time, just responding to somebody differently in their behavior in the unit. If you write somebody up, you know how much staff time it takes to write them up, to have them to go through the disciplinary process. That whole process is very staff intensive versus if the officer has an opportunity to engage with the person in the unit, figure out what the issue is, address the issue, and then we all move on. That might take more time for that one staff person, but if you compare that to all the staff time it takes for someone to go through the disciplinary process, is also less. So it takes some creativity in order to figure these things out. I would say things like, providing a correct amount of mental health treatment for people with mental health needs does take some additional staff time. So you have to kind of do those comparisons to see where you can pull. But at the end of the day, this is moving away from restrictive housing is a last step intensive process. It may require a little bit more stuff in the beginning to get to that point. And I know it's a huge struggle, but this is an area where the healthier your staff are, the better your retention's going to be. The healthier and safer your facilities are, the better your retention's going to be. I think a lot of times we focus mostly on recruitment, where really the focus needs to be just as much, if even not more so, on retention. And this is a reform that can dramatically change the retention numbers in a system. And the less retention you have, the less recruitment that you need.
Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that. And I appreciate both of you. We are at the end of the hour, so I want to thank both Keramet Reiter and Sara Sullivan for joining us today, as well as thank all of you for coming and submitting all of your very thoughtful questions. If you would like to access the recording after the event, it will be available on the event page along with the speaker biographies. And if you all could take 1 to 2 minutes to fill out the survey, that is also available there. We appreciate any feedback that you have for us. We will be having another of these in a couple of months, and the topic is yet to be determined, but will be issued shortly. So be on the lookout for that. Thanks, everybody, and enjoy your day.
Thanks to Urban for keeping this issue front and center, and we're still talking about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. Thanks, Sarah.